Excellent, wonderful. So I'm really happy to be concluding the 3 lectures that I've been giving since I've been here. And today what I want to do is continue the conversation and then examine a bit more closely what we mean when we ask, is it all good? Is that good? Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah. I want to look a bit more deeply into what we mean when we ask whether animals have social norms and whether the sort of phenomenon I've identified is actually a phenomenon of interest to norm theorists outside of this question of animal norms. As I've already mentioned yesterday, both moral and social norms have been portrayed as a property alongside of language that makes humans unique, that is only found in humans. And moral norms and social norms are just the latest in a parade of properties that have been presumed to be human unique until it's turned out that they weren't, right? Things like communication or emotions or using tools or having beliefs are among some other properties that have undergone the transition from presumed human unique to shared in some way with other animals. So when confronted with claims about stark lines, the biologist in me always gets curious and wants to scrutinize whether or not we can actually draw the line that's been proposed there and see whether there might be some hidden continuity either in the same evolutionary lineage or whether we've got environmental pressures to have these capacities evolve again and again in different lineages. So the problem I raised in the past days is that we can't investigate this question about whether animals have social norms without having a way of identifying what social norms are that doesn't presuppose that animals don't have them. And in the literature that we see with folks like Michael Tomasello, and I think, as I mentioned, people like Victor Kumar and Richmond Campbell, the way they've identified social norms either requires some sorts of cognitive capacity that, if had by other animals, would be pretty not very well distributed in the animal kingdom, or it requires some sort of linguistic processing in the case of Kumar and Campbell. And so we want to avoid that problem, allow us to ask the question, and in order to do that, as I've mentioned, I introduced this notion of a normative regularity with Evan Westra, this idea that a normative regularity is a socially maintained pattern of behavioral conformity within a community, allows us to pick out behavioral patterns in populations of individuals and say that is the phenomenon of interest. That's our explanandum when it comes to our investigation into social norms. And this is just like a methodological way to get this investigation off the ground. But some will object that this construct doesn't really get at the question of interest and that it's missing something important. And so we can think about 4 different kinds of objections to the use of this normative regularity construct in order to investigate social norms in non-human animals. In the last 2 days, I touched on these first 2 objections. First, I touched on the worry that punishment is required for social norms and that we don't see punishment in animal species. The brief recap of my response to that worry is twofold. First, that punishment, most importantly, is not the only means for social maintenance in a community, that behavioral patterns can be maintained by community members also through positive reinforcement by behaviors like modeling, teaching, rewarding, social rewards for desirable behavior. And also in response to norm violators, we don't always see punishment, even in human societies. We also see restorative justice practices and other means of pedagogical sorts of means of responding to violators. The second fold of my response to the punishment objection is that I think there is much more punishment in the animal world, non-human animal world, than is often acknowledged, because oftentimes the methods of eliciting this information comes from lab research where there might not be the kinds of punishment traditions that we would see in naturalistic settings. Okay, the second objection, the psychological objection, which I've already touched upon, my response to this objection was subject to these worries of anthropofabulation, this idea that the psychology that's often appealed to in saying this kind of psychological capacity is necessary for norms, looks at humans and confabulates the psychological capacities that are required for humans to have norms, and then says, oh, and do we find these psychological capacities in non-human animals? No, therefore they don't have norms. But we've started things out with a faulty assumptions about what's needed in the human case. So those we've already had some time talking about, and today I want to focus on the last two worries, that social norms require representing rules as such, and basically, relatedly, that this framework is too permissive. It includes things that don't count as social norms. And as Giuseppe started out in his introductory remarks, what often people seem to be really interested in when they're asking questions about social norms is whether there's rule following, whether the individuals who look like they might be following norms, whether they're actually following rules. And this is what we think of when we think of human societies and human norms, that humans are following rules and we can identify the rules that make up the norms of society. But this question of what it is to have a rule, I think, is not at all clear. There's not at all a lot of agreement about what's involved in having a rule. And there are different conceptions of rules that exist even throughout Western intellectual history. I think Lorraine Dotson has done an excellent work in her recent book on rules, showing that in the Western tradition, that there have been two conceptions of what it means to have a rule. These one conception is that rules consist of paradigms. She also describes this as thick rules. These allow us the ability to know how to go on, which harkens back to Hannah Ginsberg's work on what it is to follow a rule. But it's based on what Dotson describes as case-based reasoning, that we have exemplars of the behaviors that we need to follow, and that some interpretation is required from these cases. This is also sometimes described as just common sense. It's something that you can't necessarily articulate. You don't have the right words to describe what the rules are, but you point to the exemplar of the proper behavior. Dotson contrasts paradigms or thick rules, which she sees in particular in the history of the Christian church, with algorithms or thin rules, which require symbolic capacities, which allow us to describe things in language in a very precise way. For example, giving us step-by-step procedures, and allows us to have things like metacognitive representations of our reasons as such at each step in the way. So, for example, she gives the case of pre-modern cookbooks, and how pre-modern cookbooks exemplify both of these methods of having a rules. And the kind of cookbooks that were generated by the kind of two genres of cookbooks. One in the 17th century for the cook who's already gone through an apprenticeship and we're looking to improve their abilities to get a job in an aristocratic household in England by developing some of the latest French techniques. That those sorts of cookbooks included very thick rules. You didn't need to go into great detail about how to cook. You just gestured at the sorts of ingredients that you use or some basic technique. Whereas the other genre in the 18th century was pitched to the novice cook, someone who didn't know how to do anything and had to have everything spelled out on a step-by-step basis, right? So both of these are rules, but they're very different kinds of rules, and they weren't working for just anybody. Dotson shows how both of these sorts of rules support social norms, such as dress codes, which could be algorithmic, as they were at the Harris Academy of Bermondsey, where my daughter went to school last year, and they told you exactly how big your earring could be, and if you violated that rule and they measured it, you were out, you were in big trouble. or as thick as the norms that come from watching what the cool kids do in school and just trying to model them. The sorts of things that we have in mind when we have these questions about what it is, what rules are, alongside that, we have another set of questions that are very difficult to grapple with, and that is, what is it to follow a rule once we have an account of what a rule is? We have questions about the role of rules versus structures in society, institutions, also physical artifacts in the world, and how these support social norms, and whether we can draw a distinction between self-organizing systems that lack rules and self-governing systems that follow them. We have questions also about things like whether rationality would be sufficient for following a rule. Is that all we need? All of these questions require quite a bit of attention. I think we'll see some attention to some of these questions today, given some of the scholars who'll be speaking. And so I just, in my time, want to briefly attend to these last two. So Janine Ishmael's work on self-organization versus self-governance is one way in which this distinction between looking like a rule can describe your behavior and actually following a rule and coming from a rule is a distinction of her interest. So she writes, if we were to give a formal rendering of this difference between self-organizing and self-governing systems, the crucial difference for our purposes is that in a self-governing system, there's both an epistemic standpoint that synthesizes the collective knowledge and a system-wide deliberative standpoint that plays some role in guiding the action of the system, in which the collective good appears explicitly as a term in the utility calculation. Whereas, on the other hand, the hallmark of mere self-organization is the appearance of order in a system of interacting components without any centralized control. So there's something here that she's pointing to in the case of governments that requires a centralized control and some sort of freedom to make these decisions at different stages in following this kind of self-governance. And I think that if you take a view like Ishmael's, right, it looks in some ways it's quite Kantian. If you have to reflect on your reasons for action and know that endorse your reasons for action in order to be self-governed. But I think if we look at social norms and how they can guide behavior, we can see different places in which we have room for the self-governance here. And so if we think of knowledge of a social norm, and having that information about social norms or a pattern of behavior in our community that can guide us as an individual for a choice of behavior that would allow us to follow the social norm. There are different ways of acting consistently with a pattern of behavior. So there is freedom to make a selection of behavior there as well. And then there's also the decision of whether or not you want to follow the norm or not, whether there's some other defeater that might be in existence there, whether there might be another norm that interferes as well, or some other reason. And so in the kind of traditional Kantian way of understanding this, when you're at the place of a social norm, we can scrutinize the norm, we can ask whether this is a good norm, a norm we ought to be following. And this sort of kind of governance is the kind of governance that I think is unique to humans. And this governance isn't about norm following, it's really about norm breaking. So this idea that humans are the normative animal because humans follow norms really gets things backwards. Humans are the norm breakers and then the justifiers of breaking the norms. Whereas the other animals, I think, will be more likely to see the governance at another level, later level, in this practice of acting from norms, and that is selecting the behavior that is consistent with the pattern in their community, the way in which they can be consistent with the norm, which is a different, lower place, I think, for self-governance. And I also just briefly want to talk about rationality at the individual level of norms. So the kind of rationality that you sometimes see appeal to in order to describe acting from norms would require having this ability to do things like engage in inferential reasoning, for example, following modus ponens or engaging in deductive syllogism, which is something that's been investigated to a certain extent in non-human animals, and the ability to engage in exclusion reasoning, something like Chrysippus's dogs, a capacity to infer that the rabbit ran down the third leg of the third branch after sniffing the first two and not smelling the rabbit. Also practical rationality, the sorts of means-end reasoning that we also see broadly in non-human animal species, and self-regulation, not just acting immediately on the initial desires, but restraining one's ability to do that through different forms of inhibitory control, which again, we've seen a lot of research on in non-human animals. And so I think that if we were to appeal to rationality, we'd also see that there's some space for talking about rule following in non-human animals. Thinking about these sorts of questions about rule following at the group level or at the individual level, which is really what I've been talking about in terms of self-government, governance, and rationality, helped me see a possible motivation, another way of responding to this objection that social norms require rules. And that's what I want to address. I want to look at this way of following rules, again, not just at the individual psychological level, but at the group level. So we can state the kind of worry about rule following at the group level in this way. What might look like a rule for us is just a pattern for them. For example, when we say that a chimpanzee has a rule against violence towards infants, we might just be describing what chimpanzees do, and it's no more a norm than saying that apple trees have a rule against developing rust disease just because they have natural defenses that fight it. I think a key to answering this worry is to note that the difference between developing a disease and roughly treating an infant, a chimpanzee infant, is that only the latter is an example of behavior. Patterns that arrive from behavior are agential patterns, the result of cognitive beings deciding what to do. Comparative cognition scientists call the capacity to do things differently in the same situation behavioral flexibility. And this is sometimes seen as the hallmark of cognition, and that is required for learning. Behavioral flexibility and learning are thought to be widespread across animal species, so it counts as a minimal psychological commitment that we should expect to see pretty widespread. So when we say that a normative regularity is a pattern of behavior, we're already taking the pattern to be one that emerges from the individual choices of cognitive agents. It's already a behavior. Where there's behavioral flexibility, there's unpredictability, because it could have been otherwise. There could have been another choice. And communities can't coordinate without predictability. The murmuration of starlings, the collective choices of zebrafish, and the decision-making processes of honeybees settling on a new hive location all involve coordinating behavior, which requires predictability. When there is social learning of a behavioral pattern, we can describe it as a kind of rule following, for it captures the idea that the behavior is acquired and internalized by a cognitive being who adopts the rule, therefore conforming to community practices and making their behavior more predictable by community members by doing what they expect. And rules have the effect of constraining behavior in this way. So accounts of social norms that emphasize their status as rules reflect that social norms constrain us in a world of possible open-ended intentional behaviors. I think this gets at the motivation behind the objection that rules govern behavior and don't just describe them, and that social norms limit behavior. The pattern of behavior seen in animal communities, right, differ from the descriptive patterns in other parts of the normative rules because these patterns are socially learned. And social learning is a way of acquiring information or skill from other individuals, and it's the mechanism that supports the existence of culture, which I talked about yesterday. And I want to return to this idea that culture is a way of enforcing conformity onto a group so their behaviors are predictable and their decisions are made within a constrained logical space. So if we look at the kind of first scientific descriptions of culture, and I'm just running a little video here if it works. It won't. Came from Japan, as was already mentioned yesterday, in this well-known tale of an infant chimpanzee named Emu who started washing sweet potatoes. The behavior spread through the community. The tale of how this discovery, yeah, if you want to start that, would be great. The tale of how this discovery came to be is perhaps a bit less well-known than the fact of this behavior. So I just want to tell this story briefly. So in 1941, even before seeing Emu wash a potato, the anthropologist Kinji Imanishi was already writing about animal culture. And you can read the translation in his book with the English title, A Japanese View of Nature, which if you haven't read, is a beautiful book worthy of diving into. Imanishi described nature as an entangled web of multi-species societies, with individuals recognizing one another and communicating about their shared perspectives on their world without language. He used this idea of society to describe community in all kinds of species, even the mayfly nymphs he studied in the lab as a student, since he said they recognize one another, they form groups, and these mayfly nymphs share the same space. During World War II, Imanishi was sent to Mongolia, where he started observing wild horses. And once he was back in Kyoto University, he continued to work on horse behavior in society. He already was using the standard anthropological methods of the time, giving the horses names and discussing their personalities and social relationships. When his students Itani and Kawamura were in the field for horse research, they ran across a group of Japanese macaques. And they got really excited because the macaque community appeared more complex and integrated than the horse communities that they had been observing. They reported this to Imanishi, who joined them on a trip to Koshima Island to see these wild monkeys. Tetsuro Matsuzawa tags that day, December 3rd, 1948, as the birth of Japanese primatology. It was hard to see the monkeys at first because at the time humans were hunting monkeys and they developed a healthy fear of humans. Taking a page from their ethology background and experience feeding birds, they decided to draw the monkeys out of Koshima Island forest by provisioning them with sweet potatoes on the beach. It took 4 years before this plan bore fruit, and the monkeys were habituated to the researchers eating the provisioned sweet potatoes. The scientists focused their attention on a single troop, naming all the individuals and observing their social relationships. From this study emerged much of what we know about macaque social relationships. This approach, anthropological approach to primatology in Japan became primatology for a while, as the first primatology journal was started in Japan, and Imanishi and Itani brought their ideas to East Africa when they visited the gorillas there in 1958, 2 years before Goodall started her field study of chimpanzees in Gombe. Like the Japanese primatologist, Goodall was interested in the social structure of the chimpanzees she studied. She named the individuals. She also provisioned, and she also was able to identify some interesting social structures in these chimpanzees, right? Not just the tool use, but also the sorts of warlike behaviors that she observed. So this sorts of anthropological approach that happened in very early primatology, we're already seeing culture here in these cases as the right way to describe what was going on in these communities. And that there was slowly changing attitudes in the West over time that, yes, we can accept chimpanzee culture. Many of the behaviors that were identified once the West caught on to this and chimpanzee behaviors were identified as cultural, were not the kinds of social behaviors that were introduced, that had been identified, but were these kind of skill behaviors, use of tools for ant dipping and other sorts of things. So there were also some of these kind of non-functional and communicative behaviors that were identified, like clasping hands when you groom, or the presence of a rain dance at the beginning of a rainstorm. So this idea that there were culture in chimpanzees already has us seeing chimpanzees and then all of these other animal species that have now been also identified to have culture as learning how to do things around here in our community. That the social learning, this choice of deciding how to act and conforming to the behavior, I think we should understand as a form of rule following, just in terms of culture. I mean, the worry, though, is really related to the second worry, which I'll just briefly mention, this too permissive objection. That is that even though you can identify these patterns of behavior and there's social maintenance that exists to encourage individuals to conform to this behavior, one might still object that you're not capturing the phenomenon of interest. And I acknowledge that this is a lingering worry given the kind of construct that I've created. So perhaps marching crickets show a kind of social maintenance of others in a group when they eat their colleagues who don't move fast enough, as these crickets march across environments, denuding them and eating everything in front of them. There's a pattern of behavior, it's maintained because a cricket will eat another cricket who's in front of them if they stop walking. And if marching is a normative regularity for the crickets, one might worry I'm missing the point by identifying this as a social norm. However, I think what this example shows is that there can be a wide range of normative regularity types, making it a starting point for the development of a taxonomy of social norms. This makes it easier for norm researchers who are interested in only a certain kind of norm to clearly identify that subclass. I think this will also benefit those who are interested in the evolution of social norms, given that there may be some norm dimensions that are more or less relevant for scholars, given their theoretical orientation. So I've been identifying a number of dimensions of normative regularities that we can use that draw these sorts of distinctions. But some of these normative regularity dimensions of normative regularities would be between biological and social inheritance. So for example, these marching band crickets biologically inherit this ability. They in fact might not be rule governed. We wouldn't call this behavior cultural behavior because it's not socially acquired behavior. So though it's a normative regularity, it might not be the kind of cultural normative regularity that has the rule following nature that is of so much importance for norm theorists. Other sorts of dimensions of normative regularities that might be of particular interest to, say, people in this room would be whether there are affective states that are associated with having norms and following norms and seeing norms violated, whether there's a sense of should, a feeling of rightness when you're obeying or following along with the group pattern of behavior and when you see individuals violate them. There are other dimensions having to do with recursiveness, whether there are rules about rules, which we see as a paradigmatic case in the human case. We have rules about how to punish people, for example. We have rules about how to follow rules. This might be something, again, that is a difference between humans and other species. But I think that having these dimensions on the table allows us to more usefully draw these sorts of distinctions. So just in closing, I want to say that the account of social norms that I'm proposing, and I've discussed over the last 3 days, intends to pick out minimal normative systems, while the accounts of self-governance and governance of social norms that are often discussed in philosophy are focused on a particular type of normative system. And this particular type of normative system might not be one that's even human universal. It might be one that's really only applied to weird humans, might only be applied to some philosophers, in fact, and not normal humans in general. The kind of minimal normativity is a middle space between self-organization and self-governance, and it shines a light on what might be a late arriving capacity in human cognition, one that has been able to sustain thinking in philosophy, science, and technology, and in social institutions. This ability to actively break rules, break norms, and thereby change our social norms in ways that we think would be for the better. Thanks so much.